This is the New Revolution Element 3 Part 2 about the end of the Vietnam protest era and how reform movements changed heading into contemporary times. Okay, let's start with Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS. Remember them? They started at the University of Michigan, big into the protest movement. Well, even though, as you can see from this slide right here, they're still somewhat active today, by the late 1960s, they had actually slowed down quite a bit. In fact, the only remnant left of SDS was a terrorist group called the Weathermen, also known as Weather Underground. They were distinctly more violent than SDS had been in the past, bombing government buildings in protest. It was getting pretty obvious that the country was dividing in two, conservatives and liberals, and the liberal anti-war protest movement had a lot of other things on their mind, as you can see by the placards on this slide. And the anti-war protest movement was gaining a lot of traction, particularly because of the media attention that they were getting. Now, President Richard Nixon, who was a Republican and a conservative, basically said that they were not the majority of the country. He said they were a minority that was getting too much attention from the media. And so he called on what he felt was the majority in the country, quiet, hardworking, blue-collar, middle-class conservatives who supported what he was doing, paid their taxes, went to work every day. He called on them to be more vocal because he said that they were a quote-unquote silent majority. And so the group referred to as the silent majority in America became decidedly unsilent. Again, this was a group of conservative, middle-class, blue-collar working people. That's why they chose the construction hat, or the hard hat, as their symbol. And their group, the silent majority, also came to be known as the hard hats as well. The hard hats were the conservative answer to the more liberal anti-war protest movement. And wherever there was a protest rally, you could almost guarantee that the hard hats were going to show up, like they did here in the financial district of New York City in 1970. This was another sign of the divide between the conservatives and the liberals in America, as some people who were working on Wall Street stepped in to protect the protesters, and other people, some small business owners, were giving the hard hats coffee and applauding their efforts. The divide between the conservatives and the liberals was brought to the forefront in the 1969 movie Easy Rider, which was one of the most controversial movies in American history. And if you ever see the film and understand the time period, you'll definitely know why. Now, as we said before, a lot of things about the protest era were starting to slow down. Vietnam soldiers were starting to be removed by 1973, 2 years before the end of the Vietnam War. It had gotten to the point where Nixon had decided it was time to leave the war with honor, as he put it. And the North Vietnamese were obviously very pleased about this development. I mean, American troops had been in there to help South Vietnam, so it felt pretty good, I'm sure, to this guy to be counting troops to make sure they all boarded this plane. Now, some war veterans that came home, especially POWs, had been greeted with a very warm welcome by their families, and that wasn't altogether uncommon. But it was also very common to see protesters at the airport as troops came back from the war and then spitting on the soldiers and calling them baby killer and all sorts of other names. It wasn't the warm welcome that, at least from the nation, it wasn't the warm welcome that they had received after World War II. No ticker tape parades, nothing like that. Soldiers were told to leave Vietnam before the war was over and then come back very quietly, and they came back to an America that they didn't always recognize. For the soldiers coming back, they felt it was basically unfair how they'd been treated when the war was over. Most of them had not chosen to be in the war. They were drafted to be in the war and went over there following the orders that they were supposed to follow. The fact that the war was not greatly supported at home made things all the more difficult for them. And when they got back, really the only other ones they had left to lean on were other veterans. To this day, it really seems like we haven't given them their proper due. These were guys who were drafted into the war, were told to do a job, did the job the best they could, a lot of times when they weren't sure they wanted to be there, and came back to a country that didn't always accept them very well. And then, in 1975, they had to sit in their living rooms with the rest of us and watch on TV as the North Vietnamese communists took South Vietnam. It was 2 years after the last American troop had left Vietnam in 1973, and it left a lot of veterans wondering what they had been fighting for, what it had all been about. They weren't always sure why they had to be there. They came back to a country that didn't always want them, and it almost felt to a lot of them that they had fought for nothing. South Vietnam was gone, and a lot of veterans expressed in later interviews that they didn't know what to make of it as they watched on TV while refugees went to the top of the U.S. Embassy to be flown out by helicopter before the communists could get there, or getting on an American military ship to get out of there before the communists get there. There were a lot of people who fled Vietnam in the last remaining hours of South Vietnam as a free country. With that, the Vietnam era, both at home and abroad, came to a very quiet close by 1975. But the feminist movement, which had gained a lot of momentum in the 1960s, was still alive and well in American culture in the 1970s, in many different aspects. Women were now seen as being very strong and very independent, and comic books even started to recognize this. Stan Lee and DC Comics came out with a series of new female superheroes that reflected the new attitudes about women during that particular time. Women's rights had come a long way since the first wave of the feminist movement back in the 1800s. The second wave of American feminism, which is what the 1960s movement came to be known as, was much more radical and diverse. If you take a look at this slide here, you can see a lot of different issues being addressed on a lot of different signs. And this led to the feminist movement making some gains in the 1970s as well. For example, Title IX in 1972 prohibited discrimination in federally funded programs of any sort. The proposed Equal Rights Amendment, which you can see written on the slide in front of you here and originally suggested by Alice Paul, was also making some inroads in the 1970s. It gained approval in 28 of the required 38 states necessary for it to become an actual amendment, which was not enough, of course, but it was progress. Not all women liked the idea. Phyllis Schlafly adamantly opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, saying it would undo everything that had already been done to see women as equals, and that it would threaten the basic family structure by making women a little too radical. Schlafly was basically saying that women had made some inroads with the 19th Amendment and other things, and that we already had an Equal Rights Amendment. It was the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was equal protection under the law. The feminist movement of the 1970s also once again brought forth the issue of a woman's right to choose whether or not she should be able to have an abortion. Pro-choice became a staple of the feminist movement of the 1970s, and it was met with a lot of resistance by pro-life factions across the country. The 1973 U.S. Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade settled the issue, sort of. Norma McCorvey, who was going in the court records by the name of Jane Roe, wanted to get an abortion, which was illegal in Texas unless the mother's life was in danger after an alleged rape. Well, the court eventually ruled that abortions were going to be legal in the first 3 months of a pregnancy, the first trimester, but not necessarily legal in the last 6 months or the last 2 trimesters of a pregnancy. This didn't make either side happy. Now, as you can see from this slide here, in the early 1970s, the feminist movement was very proud and very strong. But at the same time, it was also taking some very significant steps backwards. Now, take a look at this slide for a second. You'll notice that the divorce rate in America starts to go up in 1965. Now, I've never seen any hard data that correlates that with the rise in the feminist movement during that time, but they were getting blamed for that in the eyes of a lot of people. Also, Richard Nixon vetoed a bill that would have given nationwide public daycare. He said it would weaken families if too many women used it to go back to work. Churches across the country started organizing very powerful movements against the idea of abortion. And despite the fact that Jimmy Carter signed an extension for the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, it eventually died in 1982, 3 states shy of its intended goal. One of the goals of the feminist movement was to have women get more opportunities, and by the year 2000, over 50% of women did have out-of-home jobs, but they were for lower wages and often in lower prestige careers. Sociologists still refer to this today as the quote-unquote pink-collar ghetto. One of the things we haven't really talked about much during the protest era were the reforms created by U.S. Supreme Court decisions during that time. Chief Justice Earl Warren had been appointed to that position in 1953 and famously presided over the U.S. Supreme Court when they had the Brown versus Board of Education case that said schools could no longer segregate based on color. Warren had supported individual rights ever since and was often publicly criticized for doing so. In Engel versus Vitale in 1962 and Abington Township versus Shemp in 1963, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that required prayer or Bible reading in schools was not allowed. Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963 gave you a right to have an attorney. Griswold versus Connecticut established the right to privacy in this country, and Miranda versus Arizona gave you your Miranda rights. In other words, you have the right to remain silent. Now, Nixon, acting on a campaign promise in 1968, added more conservatives to the court, including future Chief Justice Warren Burger. Nixon's hope was that Burger would reverse all the decisions made by the Warren U.S. Supreme Court, but that didn't really happen. But what about possibly the most famous part of the 1960s era, the psychedelic and very colorful counterculture that existed during that time? Well, as you can see here, by the 1970s, even they started to slow down and become a little less radical and a little more mainstream. However, the old counterculture did get some policy wins in the early 1970s. Ever since 1962, when this book, Silent Spring, had been written by Rachel Carson about pesticides, the environment had been a prime core value with the counterculture movement, and when they protested, they not only protested about the war, but about saving the environment as well. This eventually led to the government taking more steps toward the environment, with the Environmental Protection Agency being formed in 1970, and, as you see here, the first Earth Day, also in 1970. But nonetheless, by 1975, protest movements across the board were starting to wind down. And if you think about it, you can see why. If you're really impassioned about something, it's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of emotion and a lot of organization and a lot of physical, emotional toll, mental toll, however you want to describe it, psychological toll. These people had been doing this for going on 10 to 15 years by 1975. And the fact of the matter is that many of them were spent, just physically and emotionally drained. They had fought for so long for so many things and reached some of those objectives that for a lot of them this prevailing attitude of, well, what's left to fight for and do I really believe in it that much, was starting to prevail. And so, by 1975, America across the board was starting to become much more apathetic than they ever had been in the tense, tumultuous period of the 1960s. A new era begins of lost faith in government and a failing confidence in America. And with that came a prevailing attitude of, I really just don't care anymore. People started to self-reflect in support groups that began in the late 1960s and became even more popular in the 1970s. For a lot of people, the social issues of the 1960s and the effort it took to fight for those social reforms of the 1960s just wasn't worth it anymore. After all of that, it was time to start focusing on yourself, self-reflection, improving yourself and your situation. Even in schools, the concept of self-reflection and improving yourself was becoming more and more popular. So, the 1970s had brought us a lot less social tension, a lot less effort to make significant change, and a lot more effort just to calm down because, frankly, we're just tired and we've had enough. An attitude which eventually brought us disco. Now, compared to the folk songs and other music of the 1960s, which really seemed to have a lot of social purpose to it and reflected that time, well, disco basically reflected the attitudes in the 1970s, the idea of I really just don't care anymore. No offense to anybody who likes it. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.